I just never expected that world would find me here.
Hi everybody, this is a book tag, and I was tagged by Olly from Criminolly, so thanks for tagging me. It's an awesome tag, and it took me a little while to get my head around what I wanted to choose for it, but it's a really good tag. It's called Generally Speaking. So I love the pun, so clearly we're almost saying generally speaking, but generally speaking. So this is about genres. This is about looking at books that either cross over into different genres, or if you want to subvert the prompts like I have, that just give you a different feeling than the initial way it would have been advertised. But clearly we do look at books quite often in their genres, so especially if, like me, you read a lot of speculative fiction, so you read like science fiction, fantasy and horror, you go to those sections, and I go to those sections first, and then eventually I get to the general fiction bit, but I spend almost the whole time in a bookshop looking at the science fiction, fantasy and horror section. So clearly my head is in the genre mindset, and I think we're all like that, and I think that's true for any art, really. So it's quite an interesting subject to look at anyway. I mean, I'm a musician and a music teacher, and we're always debating the whole definition of genres thing, and it gets more and more complicated the later the music gets. But yeah, as far as books go, the prompts here, there's 7 prompts that Olly from Criminolly has created, and they're really good prompts that basically take most of the genres that might be something you look at and ask you to come up with something that crosses into that genre, or you would like to represent that genre. So the first prompt is horrifying book that isn't horror. So what's interesting about these questions is that sometimes things get labelled with 2 or 3 different tags anyway, but I've tried to come up with things that I don't think would have been given that title. So for this first one, horrifying book that's not horror. So Make Room by Harry Harrison is an absolute classic. If you haven't read it, I'd absolutely recommend you read it. It's one of my favourite books, but it's a really important book, I think. It's a dystopian novel, but it's not really about government controlling everything. I mean, they do control a lot of things, but it's because resources have got so bad because of overpopulation and overconsumption, and the way that the world's developed 30 years after it's written. So it was written in 1966 and it's set in the 90s, late 90s, and most animals are extinct. Water is rationed because there's so few of it left. The population has gone absolutely crazy, and there's no space. That's a really rare commodity, to have space. It's a nightmarish society that has been depicted in this book, and there was a very famous film called Soylent Green. It's a great film from the 70s, but the big twist ending is not in this book. They put that in the film, which is quite ironic because it's kind of like what's really famous about the film. But the film's got a lot going for it anyway, but the book has got loads going for it. So even regardless of whether that twist is in it, it's a great book. But it's very horrifying. It's very grim, and it's a very stark depiction of the future. And it's also quite possible as well. So I think we do have an issue with overpopulation and overconsumption and an absolute disregard for the natural world. And the things in here could happen. So yeah, I think it's a horrifying book from that point of view. So that's my choice for a horrifying book that is not horror. Second prompt is a book with a terrible crime that's not a crime novel. So this is an interesting one because I didn't know this was going to happen in this book. It's one of the strangest books I've read, I'd say. I didn't know where it was going, and when the crime happens, it comes out of nowhere, and it's quite shocking. I'm just going to hold it up. I don't know if you guys have read this. It's a book by Mishima, who's a very famous Japanese author, possibly because of the film that was made about him, and he's just one of those people that people find out about, even if they haven't read his works. And the book is The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea. And it's a quite short novel, but it's quite a powerful novel. It's also quite an odd novel in its message and in the characters that are depicted, and the events of the, especially the ending, the events of the book, the ending of the book. It's one of those books that stays with you because it's so challenging. Mishima's political ideals were extremely old-fashioned. He had a very rigid idea of what masculinity was and what a proper man was, and how people should be brought up, how society should encourage people to develop as children. And all of that is in this book. And the way the narrative plays out is part of that. And I can't spoil it by telling you what the crime is, but when the crime does happen, it's absolutely wrapped up in this archaic ideology that Mishima felt very strongly about, very passionately about. So, it's quite disturbing, I'd say, but it's not really graphic or anything. It's just disturbing what happens and why it happens, really, more importantly than what happens, but why it happens. I'm trying to be mysterious because I don't want to spoil it, but this is definitely a good example of a crime in a book that's not a crime book. It's definitely not a crime book. It's just a kind of slice of life kind of thing, but because Mishima's ideology is so strong, there's all sorts going on in here. So, yeah, The Sailor Who Fell from Grace with the Sea, Mishima. The third book, I'm probably subverting the prompt a little bit here, but hopefully some of you guys will totally relate to this. So the third prompt is a book about love that isn't romance. And I am choosing this lovely book about Star Trek. So I love Star Trek, always have done. I discovered Star Trek as a kid, and I have watched every incarnation of Star Trek and all the movies. I am getting through Enterprise because I'm finding that probably the hardest one out of all of them, because I think it's so slow and not a lot happens and I can't grab onto it as much. But there are some good moments. But yeah, I think Enterprise at the moment for me is a bit tough. But I absolutely love so many things about Star Trek. It's always been a big love of mine. And my favourite, by the way, is Deep Space Nine. So don't know if anyone wants to comment about that. But my favourite incarnation of Star Trek is Deep Space Nine. There are some really lovely things that just happened in the Picard finale, which was kind of nice for any Next Generation fans, or fans of Picard's ongoing story, and you know, if you liked Q, some of the things that happened with Q was really cool in the finale. I'm not going to go on about that, but I love Star Trek basically, and this is a really nice book. For anyone who likes Star Trek, quotable Star Trek, you can probably imagine what it is. It's loads of quotes from Star Trek. Because of when it came out, at the time, the only things that were out were the initial original series, Next Generation, Deep Space Nine, and Voyager. So I've had this book since then. So it's quite nice that it's kept its condition, which is good. But Enterprise hadn't come out, and obviously Discovery and Picard hadn't come out, and the J.J. Abrams films hadn't come out. So they're not included in this book. I don't know if there's a newer edition. There might be a newer edition. But this is a really cool book. It takes different aspects of the shows within the chapters. So it looks at sort of politics, and it looks at justice and law. It looks at romance. It looks at parents, children and family, big theme. There's a picture of Chief O'Brien there. Theology and faith, picture of Kira Nerys. What a show. Good and evil, and the incredible Golden Cat there. DS9 is so amazing. Life and Death, one of the weakest characters in Star Trek, I think. But hey, I'm not going to be negative. Human Nature, really awesome. 7 of 9. The way they wrote for 7 and 9 was really good when they brought her into Voyager, and fantastic relationship there between Geordi and Data, and that chapter's called Humour, and it's just got loads of quotes from the show in the book, and if you love Star Trek, then you'll love this book. I will give you a couple of quotes. So, the trouble with tribbles, Chekhov and Spock. So, Chekhov said, "I was making a little joke, sir." And then Spock says, "Extremely little, Ensign." There's Spock. The Great Quark. Where are we? Quark saying war is good for business. Relax, brother. Nog isn't going to destroy the Ferengi way of life. He just wants a job with better hours. Here we go. Such a Star Trek quote. People can be selfish, irrational, stubborn, malicious, you name it, but computers don't have those failings. I mean, it's just loads and loads of them. Oh, this is cool. This is a quote from Wesley and Riker. Wesley says, "But what if I'm wrong?" And Riker says, "Then you're wrong. It's arrogant to think you'll never make a mistake." Brilliant piece of leadership advice there. I don't know if you guys know the episode. It's one of the best Star Trek episodes. DS9 episode, Far Beyond the Stars, which Avery Brooks directed as well. And there's a quote here from a character called Kay Eaton, which could have been Nana Visitor's character, I'm not sure. It might have been Terry Farrell's character. But anyway, the quote is, "Science fiction needs more strong women characters." Well, there we go. So, yeah, great book. And I'm very tempted to do a top 10 Star Trek episodes in respect to Star Trek. Anyway, yeah, book about love, because anyone that has this clearly loves Star Trek, and the book is all about how quotable it is because it's got such great scripts without being a romance book. So that's the third prompt. The fourth prompt is a book with a puzzle that isn't a mystery. So, for this one, there's loads of puzzles. 100 puzzles. These are 100 thought experiments. So, the pig that wants to be eaten. I've mentioned this before in my video about non-fiction books, but I thought it'd be really nice to mention it again as a response to this prompt, because this is a really nice way into philosophy. So, if you figure, oh, that kind of sounds a bit curious, I wouldn't mind delving into that a little bit, but who the hell do I read? This is a really good way in, because it gives you a puzzle, gives you a thought experiment, or a dilemma, or some situation that you think, what would be the moral, ethical way to solve this puzzle? And underneath that, it tells you some of the philosophers that would have looked at that kind of dilemma, or would have given you some kind of worldview or attitude to life that reflects the situation that was described in the thought experiment. So it's a really nice way into philosophy, but it's also a really good book in itself anyway, and you can read that, get a lot out of that without going any further. But I think that's what Julian Baggini wrote it for. I think it was to get people into thinking about ethics and thinking about those kind of elements of philosophy. But yeah, 100 puzzles in this one, and honestly I couldn't recommend it enough. It was introduced to me when I first started teaching critical thinking, and the guy that was leading the course said, "Oh, have a look at this book, because it might be a really nice thing that you might want to bring in to the lessons sometimes and get the students thinking about these questions." And he's absolutely right. It's a great thing to use for students to explore ideas about morality and their own take on ethics, and you can get a really good debate out of it. But obviously this isn't just for teachers to use for their students. This is just a really good book. So The Pig That Wants to Be Eaten, Julian Bagnini, really, really good book. Okay, so prompt number 5. A book with magic that isn't fantasy. I hope that Ollie isn't going to roll his eyes when I absolutely subvert the prompt again. But when I think magic, and I'm not thinking fantasy, the magic that I see in the world all the time is music, and the way that we, our relationship with music, humans' relationship with music, is an incredible, beautiful, unobtainable, unexplainable, magical thing. And you can talk about music theory. You can talk about why those notes work better than those other notes, and why there's a clash, or what a clash sounds like. But why is that a clash? Why is dissonance dissonant? Why is the common chord progressions that we like to hear, why are those notes that are in those triads, those initial notes that make up those chords, why do they make sense to us? Why do we want our music resolved at the end of it? Why do we want the first chord to be the last chord? Why do we want that? But more importantly, how does music make us feel so much? It's magic. It's absolute magic. And I just wanted to talk about 2 books that explore that. So this is a really cool book called This Is Your Brain on Music by Daniel Everton. Takes lots of different aspects of the way that we react to music, chapter by chapter, looking at rhythm and pitch and tone, melody, harmony, all these different things that are looked at in this book. And it's a really good bit of neuroscience for the way you react to music. And this one, Music, the Brain and Ecstasy, how music captures our imagination. Robert Jordan, another really good book on that subject. And I couldn't recommend these 2 books more than I do here. Great books. There's another one as well that I couldn't find called The Music Instinct by Philip Ball. That's a really good one as well. But these books that are neuroscience books on the way that we react to music and our relationship with music are just wonderful things to read. And if you really think about the way music changes us and moves us and can affect our day and the way that we want it everywhere, because even people that don't listen to music proactively hear music all the time because it's all around us. All that kind of thing makes it such a magical part of our everyday life, and is quite an interesting, fascinating part of our nature, our human nature. So that's my answer to the prompt about magic that isn't in fantasy. Okay, so the 6th prompt is a book that thrilled you that isn't a thriller. And I actually talked about this quite recently because I was talking about The Blade itself and I mentioned this book. But I have to go with this because there were some others I thought of that could work. Like, for example, I thought Andy Weir's book The Martian is really thrilling. I think I genuinely felt my heart going when I was reading it. It's really brilliantly written, and the way the character's plight develops, and the way that there seems to be a solution, and then the whole kind of third act where it is trying to bring that solution to effect is so thrilling. But I've got a feeling it's been called a thriller. I think it's been called a science fiction thriller. So I thought I won't use that because, like a lot of books and a lot of films and blah, 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 a lot of these things get given more than one genre name quite often. So I thought that was the case with The Martian. But there are examples like that, which are clearly science fiction or something like that, but they are thrillers. But this one, I don't think this has ever been called a thriller. So this is clearly a fantasy book. It's part of the first part of a trilogy, The Final Empire, Brandon Sanderson, and the first book of The Mistborn. And I read this last year, and I can't wait to read the rest of it. But I have heard the second book has got a different pace to it. It's got a different the way that the world building happens and the way the characters develop is a lot slower, because it kind of delves into the characters a little bit more, and this one rattles along so fast. It does develop the characters. I mean, I think it's brilliantly written. Honestly, I think I don't think you can fault it, to be honest. But one of the chief things that makes me want to put it in this prompt, the idea that it's thrilling, is its pace. And it's basically a fantasy heist plot, but the way it moves and the way the world builds while it's creating that plot and creating these characters that would undertake the heist, it's done in a way that you can see there's a lot of peril in it, and there's a lot of, the stakes are high, and things, they get knocked back now and again, but there's this sense of purpose, there's a sense of achievement, there's a sense of being knocked back, there's all sorts of stuff going on, and it is genuinely thrilling. And talking about heists and nipping out of books for a second, something that didn't have a lot of peril, and I think it suffered for it, but my reaction to Ocean's 11, the George Clooney remake, was that I felt like there wasn't any peril. It just looked like they were just sort of going through the motions. It was fine. It was obvious it was going to succeed, and that was why it wasn't that thrilling. Whereas with this, there was a sense of foreboding sometimes. There was a sense of the scale of what they were doing. They kept saying, we are crazy to do what we're about to do, but they figured they had to try it because the consequences would be so positive if they did succeed. So with the characters constantly saying, what are we doing? We must be out of our minds. And you're reading that, and it's kind of helping that sort of thrilling aspect of it. It's just really cool. So yeah, that's my response to the prompt about something that's thrilling that isn't a thriller. And then the last prompt is something with science in it that isn't science fiction. So I made a little quip on this thing saying, well, surely if it's got science in it, it's science fiction. But there's a lot of non-fiction books out there, and I'm sure there's lots of ways that you can put science in a book without being science fiction. Let's face it. So I bought this book initially because I wanted to look into the subject, and it's about the science of sleep, and I was looking to possibly write a story based around insomnia, and I wanted to look into what really happens when we don't sleep for days. And I was going to sort of build a narrative around that. I don't sleep a lot, so I do find it fascinating, the whole subject anyway, because I can function quite well with only about 6 hours sleep. If I get less than that, then I start to suffer, but I don't really need a lot more than that, although I do have moments where I sleep for ages, so that could be like body catching up or something, I don't know. But I'm a very heavy sleeper when I do sleep, though, so I'm usually difficult to wake up, and I usually go quite deep into my sleep very quickly. But yeah, why we sleep and what our brain does while we're sleeping is really interesting, really fascinating. And this is a great book about why we need to sleep and what our body does when we sleep and what would happen if we didn't sleep. So yeah, if you haven't heard of this, it's worth getting. It's a good sort of popular science book about sleep. So there we go. That's my response to the Criminolly speaking book tag, which is really awesome bit of pun usage, but also just a great opportunity to talk about how books often get labelled as one thing but are often doing something else as well, or they're often giving us other avenues to explore. And I mean, the non-fiction ones, it's kind of obvious in it, they're not necessarily that has never been described as science fiction, but the fiction ones definitely cross into other genres, and I think that's the general point of the tag and why Olly wanted to create it, to show that sometimes these boundaries are too rigid. And like I was saying at the beginning, that's true for most art forms, I think, but I think most people realise that, And if you do say, I only read science fiction, then you're clearly losing out on lots of things. And if you say, I only read Westerns or something like that, then, you know, there are going to be lots of tropes that you would like to see in Westerns that you would see in other genres of literature. So, you know, you don't want to restrict yourself. So if that is what the genre definitions are doing for you, then that's not really a good idea. But clearly they're quite good devices for you to go into a store and find a book quickly, or find relative books quickly. But I would advise people in general to look around the general fiction sections of the books if they're looking to buy some fiction, because there's some absolute gems there that you might not realise if you're just going in the speculative fiction bit. So, yeah, that's probably an obvious thing to say. But I think that's the point of the tag, that generally speaking, I just said generally speaking by accident, generally speaking, you will find loads of different things that you like in the genres that you don't necessarily go to straight away. And I think that's kind of an awesome thing to think about, innit? I haven't tagged anyone yet, so I need to do that. So I'm going to tag Michael from Fit to Be Read, and also Justin from This Just In. So I don't know if you guys have done it, or if you've seen it and don't want to do it, or whatever. I don't even know if Justin's going to see this video, but I'm going to tag you guys because I'd like to know what you think. And thanks for watching, everyone. Thanks a lot. Bye.
Picture of what it's like to be you. Sit up on your high chair.